All right, I'm admitting the audience, and you're ready to go.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining. My name is Gui Cozzi. I'm the cybersecurity practice lead for Dorton. And today I'm going to talk about building a secure remote workforce. So I've got a few polls in this presentation. So to participate, please dial with your cell. I think that's the easiest thing to do. 22333, and then enter Dean Dorton as you do that. Just give you a few seconds to do that. The objectives of the sessions are looking at information technology trends, cybersecurity considerations, technical controls, and the human factor of this transition to working remotely. So we've got our first poll here. If you're thinking about your organization, your coworkers, you still have remote workers. A would be all the workforce is back at the office. B would be most of the workforce is back at the office. C would be some workforce still work remotely. And D, most of the workforce is remotely. So here looks like, for that response here, most of the workforce is back at the office. What we see with the organization that we work with is it's often a hybrid environment where some workforce still works remotely, and then a portion of the workforce is back to the office. So if we think back to the early stages of the pandemic, there was a rush from organizations to be able to allow their staff to work from home, to work remotely. But there was also some concerns around information security and the potential for an increased likelihood of data breaches with some of these remote workers. And if we think about the technological changes, we can think about having to use potentially new devices, maybe new laptops, maybe using the webcam, new communication software like Teams, WebEx, Zoom, having more and more cloud services, so not having to connect necessarily back to the office, and then having to deal with the home office. So these are kind of the IT trends that happened during that change. But from a data security perspective, what we've seen is, according to that study from IBM, half of the workforce was asked to use their personal laptops to conduct business. Most of the time with no new tools to secure it, and no specific training on how to secure the information. No specific guideline to handle personal identifiable information, despite of having to handle this kind of data. More than half of the respondents didn't know of any new policies to secure the information. So what does that mean from a cybersecurity perspective? When we do traditional IT security assessment, we look at the different layers of cybersecurity. that you can see here on the slide. And some of these traditional security frameworks can really help assessing the risk of that new paradigm of being able to work from home. Here in these different layers, we have to ask ourselves the question, what's changed with an increased remote workforce? So we've got another poll here. Have you updated your security risk assessment to account for a remote workforce? So A would be not yet. B would be I'm in the process of updating it. C would be yes. And D would be yes, and I have continuous monitoring in place. So that's a great thing that people are thinking about updating their security risk assessment. We're about 2 years from the start of that trend. We see a lot of organizations that are still working through that process. They've worked for many years on a security risk assessment process, but sometimes it's not up to date, and it doesn't take into consideration the risk presented by the remote workforce. So let's take some example. Ransomware today is still top of mind in terms of cybersecurity threats. When we look at statistics, the median cost for a ransomware infection across all industries is a wide range. It's between $1 to $6 million in terms of loss of revenues, loss of productivities, cost to remediate the incidents, potential notification if you're handling with PII or sensitive data, regulated data. So it is top of mind for many organizations. And here on the slide, I'm not going to get into all the detail, but you see the main vectors that a typical ransomware threat would leverage to get into the environment. So, two big paths, two main avenues: credential theft, so being able to compromise a user's password or credential, and a vulnerability that could be exploited. So we're looking at all of these paths here that would allow a ransomware to fully execute. And then we need to look at the controls that could mitigate these kind of infections. So the next slide here is looking at some of these key controls. So for instance, to read that slide, the first top left key vector is the phishing attack. So we are looking at number 5, provide security training. Number 9, email domain protection. And number 14, protective domain name system, or DNS. So we have to ask ourselves the question is, when we send people working from home and they can work from their personal device, or they can work from their home office, are these controls, if we had them at the office, are they still applicable in a home office environment? Are they still applicable if the person is working from a Starbucks or from anywhere in the world? So training might be, but there may be some differences. There may be some new information. And we'll talk about some of these key controls in place, but that's how we would conduct a risk assessment, a gap analysis, looking at the threat model. Is the threat model different with the remote workforce? Did we have the controls in place before? How do they apply in the new environment? And this is an example of risks that you might look at in this new environment. So we talked a little bit about bring your own device. What does that mean? Can you store company information on your personal device? Can you use unsanctioned application that might not be approved? So when you have a phone or a tablet, it's very easy to install them on the device and share some data with these applications. If you don't control the information and the data, your information may end up in the wrong hands. Outdated vulnerable software. How do you patch devices that are outside of the network? Too much access. It's easy for organizations to grant too much privilege to the users in the hope to have less support calls. So I'll give you an example. If you're working from home and you try to install different communication software, some users are granted the right to access to install these applications on their devices. But by doing so, they may expose the device and therefore the company information to malicious activities. But really, when we think about it, we've talked about technical controls, but it's a lot broader than that. It is not just about technology. It's about people and it's about processes. So let's talk about some of these processes here, and we're going to go through the list. So again, looking at some studies that were published, it's so important to provide the right expectation on how to secure the data, the devices, the network. The first step is to look at the policies. Do you need to update your security policy, your acceptable use policy, How do we account for IT-specific processes like change management, incident response, business continuity plan? And from a human resources standpoint, how do we onboard and offboard employees in that new paradigm? So a very important policy or document, sometimes you could find it in the employee handbook, is that acceptable use of IT assets is what are the expectations for employees on when they use their devices, when they access the IT systems to keep that information safe and secure. I've listed here on this slide some questions that such policies should be able to address. How do you access the network from when you work from home? You have to connect to a VPN. Is that a choice or is that a requirement? If you connect via a VPN, your network traffic may be more secure. Can you use your personal computer, phone, or tablet to conduct business? Most organizations would allow employees to check their emails on their personal cell phones. But they may have to push some specific controls so that that information cannot be forwarded or shared with an unsecured application or third party. Can I print from home? And that's a question that we have from time to time. If you're handing confidential information, but you have a need to print that information because you have to physically sign the document, how do you handle these physical documents? I probably need to have a shredder, for instance. Can you save the document on your local hard drive, or do they need to be maintained on the company's server? How do you send confidential information? it's something that we'll talk again during that presentation. There may be specific tools, software that are used to allow you to share sensitive information with your clients, with your customers, with third parties. These tools should be vetted by IT and IT security departments, and you should know how to use them. So your employees need to know that they do exist and they need to have training. If not, it's easy to find workaround, maybe using an unofficial or unsupported, unsanctioned Dropbox, for instance, to send files. Probably not a good idea. And looking at the privacy aspect of the home office, if you have confidential discussion, phone calls, can you keep that space private? So the answers to these questions, and these are just examples, are going to be different for different companies and different organizations. You may find different questions, you may find different risks, but the bottom line is that guidance needs to be available to your employees, and the acceptable use policy is a great way to start. From a process standpoint, we also need to think about change management. How do we bring new technologies? How do we bring end user support to these devices, to that remote workforce? Can we effectively and securely support devices that are not physically at the office? How do we manage changes on these devices? How do we push security updates? Next poll question is about your incident response plan. A would be, we don't have one, or I'm not sure that we have one. B would be, it has not been updated in the past year. C is we update it every year. And D is we update it and test it every year. So that's great. It's a living document. And I've got a slide, so hold on to that. And I've got a slide that goes into more detail about what's an incident response plan and what should be the elements inside such a plan. So it is a tailored document that is meant to assist a company in identifying, responding to, and limiting the impacts of a cyber attack. You have to ask yourself the question is, in that remote environment, do we need to update the plan? For instance, if you were used to work in an open space environment, somebody got a phishing email and may announce to everyone, hey, I just got a strange email. Don't click on the link, delete the email. How do you do that when you work from home? Are you using a messenger platform to send a quick communication? Are you sending a mass email? Do you have a phone tree that you can use? An incident response plan should be tested every year at a minimum. And it should be specific to threats that you are concerned about. So there should be playbooks within your plan that would address what is critical, what you're hoping doesn't happen. So we talked about ransomware, and it's probably a correct statement to say that every organization out there should have a specific response playbook on ransomware in their incident response plan. Maybe think about that business email compromise. And if we send the wrong information to customers with different banking information, how do we mitigate some of these threats here? And something that is tied to incident response is looking at your existing cyber insurance policy. And by the way, most organizations should consider having a cyber insurance policy in place. It used to be very easy to have an insurance policy for cyber risk, but it's getting harder and harder. The underwriting process is becoming very strict, and insurance companies are mandating specific controls. So it's not just a matter of settling for a higher deductible, higher premium, and a lesser coverage. Most of the time today, it's a matter of, can you get coverage? Do you have enough controls in place so that you can get a cyber insurance? And if you had the coverage in the past, make sure that you have discussion with your broker as soon as possible, because the market is drastically changing. Premiums have increased about 40% across the board, and it's getting harder and harder to get coverage. So one of the processes that most underwriters are going to ask is about your incident response. You have one, hasn't been tested. So let's talk a little bit about the technical controls when we deal with remote workforce. How do we secure that environment? So that's some of the domains here that we need to think about. We'll go through the list in more detail, but a common denominator across all the categories is going to be logging monitoring. You need to have some kind of visibility on the environment. It used to be that you could log a lot of information using a firewall. This is no longer the case. Threats have evolved. Most of the threats are now on the endpoint, meaning workstations and laptops. And these devices are moving. They don't have to sit in the office anymore. We've talked about that several times here. So how do you get that information that you need from these devices? So the first domain is access control. So MFA stands for multi-factor authentication. Most people now know what that is. It's a combination of multiple authentication factors. It could be something that you know, like a password or a PIN, plus something that you have, like your phone, for instance, or something that you are, to be like biometrics, so looking at retina, face, palm, scans, etc., etc. So multi-factor authentication is an absolute minimum for all remote access. MFA greatly reduces the risk of compromises, of credential theft, and we talked earlier about how credential theft is directly tied to the risk of ransomware. MFA has to be in place at a minimum for all remote access, including cloud environment. So when we think about emails, most organizations are using Office 365, Google Suite to host their emails. They are in the cloud. And it is some kind of remote access when you think about it. You can access your email from anywhere. So think about it as a remote access. Any SaaS application, HR payroll, for instance, your ERP, your CRM, anything that you access remotely must have MFA in place to protect the accounts, protect access to the systems and information. Using strong passwords is extremely important. It used to be very complicated with password. The guidance from security practitioners was to change password every so often. Every month or every 90 days, you're going through a password change. And it used to be a best practice. Now the best practice, according to NIST and Microsoft and security practitioners, is to use a very strong password with MFA. And you don't necessarily have to change that password unless there's a suspicion that that password is being compromised. We recommend the use of password filter that would prevent users from creating easy to guess password to be in place. And in addition to that, I mentioned earlier in the presentation how easy it is to grant users too much permission, too much access. Making sure that your users don't have local admin rights, for instance, even on the devices that you're using remotely, working from home. The next domain is endpoint protection. And again, endpoint could be the laptop, the desktop, tablet, phones, etc., etc. There has to be a process in place to install security updates relevant to each of the applications on these devices. So not just the operating system, but the third-party application as well. Detection and response. It is the next generation antivirus. It provides logging information on pretty much any actions taken at the device level. And it's very, very important if you're handling sensitive information, for instance. In most data breaches instances, it's very difficult to ascertain for sure what data was accessed by the threat actors, what data was exfiltrated. A tool like detection and response software got the capabilities to log everything, any files, any processes running in memory, anything on the devices. These are also better at preventing modern threats. And with some of this technology, you can quickly contain the devices wherever they are. So only allowing your IT or your IT security team access to these devices if a malicious activity is being suspected. And then the next point on endpoint protection is encryption, of course. Most of the time you are dealing with mobile devices or devices that are in a quote-unquote unsecure location. So we want to make sure that if these devices are stolen or lost, that the data cannot be recovered. So email is a big deal. Of course, we use email every day. And as we looked and studied in that ransomware attack vector slide, it is one of the primary vectors for ransomware and malware. So you need a modern email security platform that at least got these three features. Phishing protection, which would also include impersonation protection. This would mitigate the risk of business emails compromise. The second one, URL rewrite, is making sure that all the links that could be malicious or leading you to a fake website asking for credentials are inspected before the emails are being delivered. So the URL are all rewritten to point to the secure platform, and the result can be analyzed and safer before emails are being delivered. Attachment detonation is the same concept. It's before an email is delivered to the end users. Any attachment is opened in a secure environment by the software to make sure that there's no malicious code that's running. So we believe that these three controls as part of email security are a new baseline. And then the last point here is network security. So how do we secure that traffic wherever you work from? That be from home, when you travel. Do you have to connect to servers or systems that are back to the office? And if so, then the use of a secure VPN with MFA in place is probably a good idea. Some organizations don't really have local servers anymore and have more and more of these cloud resources. So a VPN may not be a requirement. We recommend to have a DNS security control in place, as well as a web traffic inspection. And that's really to make sure that when browsing the web, the malicious sites are quickly identified, reported, and blocked. And if we have a site that was not categorized as malicious, but we can quickly know which employees, which users went to that website, maybe clicked on a link, so we can then exercise our incident response plan. So now let's talk about the human factors in securing that remote workforce. It's fair to say that remote workers can have some anxiety, feel pressured to be available at all hours of the day. According to studies, most work longer hours than before. Some can fear that their job would be at risk if they didn't go above and beyond. And most of them do not take regular time off. These are kind of the red flags that show that there's some anxiety there on some of that remote workforce. What does it have to do with cybersecurity and securing that workforce? Well, there's a risk of burnout. And what does that mean from a security perspective? Maybe it's paying less attention to potential security issues, may not be able to identify the red flag, may not care to report some of the weird thing that you're saying that might indicate a security issue or security incident. Some of the staff may also choose to implement workarounds. For instance, I've talked about that Dropbox scenario, but There's a big file that needs to be transferred to a customer. There's no clear guidance on how to do that. Let's set up a quick Dropbox and hope it's sent to the wrong recipients. It's out of control. Maybe using personal devices or accounts, if the company's email system doesn't work as expected, or some things are blocked, some people may be tempted to use their personal email accounts. Going back to the phishing, most of them require the workforce to be trained and the workforce to be able to pay attention. So I've got 3 examples here. If we start with the Bank of America email, there's all the red flags that have been highlighted here on why this is a phishing email. The wrong sender, sent to a bunch of people, there's typos, the links appear to go to bankofamerica.com, but goes somewhere else. There's a sense of urgency. There's all kind of red flags. Making sure that you're training your staff to recognize these red flags requires to pay attention to the email that they're receiving. So not just the training, but being able to do regular phishing testing and see how they improve. I picked the Netflix example here because, again, working from home, it's easy to blur the line between work and home. So where is that email going to, that Netflix phishing email? Is that going to your home computer where you've got some organization, company information? And if you realize that password, that Netflix password has to be changed because you got that phishing emails, you just clicked on the link, make sure that the workforce is trained not to reuse their password. We don't want them to use the same password at work that they use for their personal accounts. Because if one password is compromised, it's one of the things that threat actors will try to do is reuse that password and see if they can get to different services and if they can get into your company data. And then the bottom left is that CEO, CFO impersonation email. It looks like it's coming from somebody important in the company, but if you look at the return email, it's not the same there. Another example, if you're not really paying attention, is that MFA prompt. So this is an example using the Microsoft Authenticator app here. Sorry. And when you're logging in, the second factor is a prompt on your phone. So you want to make sure that your staff is trained to recognize that this prompt should appear just after they sign in. And you don't want them to just click approve if they're not just signing to a new device, for instance. Because what threat actors are doing is they try to, if they compromise your password using a phishing email, but they are blocked by the second factor, they may try to trigger that prompt here again and again and again, or at a very inconvenient time. So let's say a Monday morning at 8 a.m., you've got a few prompts like that, and finally you click approve, and now the threat actors is in your account, and then they can add their second factor authentication to their account, and now the account is compromised. So when I think about secure, I also think about how to be resilient. So if you got access to the chat feature in the meeting, let me know what you do or what you think you're doing to foster a resilient team. What does that mean to you? What are you doing to foster a resilient team? So improve communication, because yeah, that's a good one. Ongoing communication. So we'll give you some tips here. There's a framework that was put in place by a pediatrician, looking at the 7 C's of resilience: competence, confidence, connection, character, contribution, coping, and control. And if you Google that framework, there's a lot of information for leaders to make sure that they understand and to account for these 7 C's when they communicate and deal with their team, to improve the resiliency of the team. And reflect on your organization culture. Use empathy, cultivate emotional intelligence, practice active listening, create a culture of transparency and trust, and make meaningful and specific operational changes to support the remote workforce. I think we've talked a little bit about the policies, the processes, the technologies. All of these combines can really foster that remote workforce. And some tips to prevent burnout. What are the boundaries? When are you going to disconnect from work? Making sure that you encourage your teams to take time off on a regular basis. It's something that we do at Dorton is, we keep a look at these PTOs, make sure that the team takes advantage of that time to re-energize. Communication and training are extremely important. What resources do you have to keep your employees engaged, informed, and how do you leverage these new technologies that are often cloud-based to support that remote workforce? And at the end, I would say, don't forget that security risk assessment, that incident response plan, and that training for the remote workforce, extremely important. So do we have any questions? I don't see any question in the chat. So thank you very much for attending and have a great day.